The underlying question here, as in many other fora, is really how do we rekindle economic growth? In a 1987 speech accepting the Nobel Prize for Economics, the professor, thank you so much, Robert Solow, demonstrated that technological innovation is the ultimate source of productivity and growth. And as we seek to rekindle our economy in the wake of the 2008 meltdown, many echo his thoughts. As then CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, said around that time, we're going to have to innovate our way out of this thing, and our great universities will have to lead the way. Now, turning that realization into reality is not easy. There are plenty of policy proposals about giving individuals the right background and incentives to innovate, and I hope they'll be enacted. I think, however, we should also approach the problem in a different way, one that actually focuses on the interaction of individuals. Further, while what I'm about to discuss ought to be a national priority, as an organizing and managerial manner, it really needs to be done at the state and local level. It starts with the simple question, how can states and local governments enable improved collaboration within and among various economic ecosystems in their communities? And this question, simple on the surface, has its roots in lessons we saw as we were developing the National Broadband Plan. So what I want to talk about today are some of those lessons about innovation, about the idea that high-performance collaboration turns out to be the killer app of the next generation of the internet, and some concrete steps communities can take to make sure that they ride rather than are crushed by those waves of innovation to come. Let me start by talking about 4 lessons we thought were interesting about innovation. The first was, let chaos control. Now, there's a new bestseller by Tom Friedman and Michael Mandelbaum about how the United States is not what it once was, entitled That Used to Be Us. And they express, there's a guy named Carlson, who's a great innovator, who expresses the following law: innovation from above tends to be orderly and dumb, innovation from below tends to be chaotic and smart. And there's actually a lot of significant academic work that backs this up. There's also an interesting historical example in the remarkable period in the 17th and 18th century as humanity moved away from the Malthusian trap in which GDP growth was merely a function of population growth. England and France approached innovation in 2 very different ways. England went with a patent system which was very chaotic and allowed anybody to get the benefits of innovation, whereas France went with a royal patent system which was very top-down. England GDP grew 250 times what France's grew. So this notion that innovation is really a bubbling up function, I think, is an important thing to keep in mind. So we really need to spread the way we think about innovation in a distributed manner. Secondly, get everything on the table. As those who watched the movie Apollo 13 might remember, NASA faced one of its biggest crises when the spaceship was caught behind the moon. And the engineers at NASA needed to essentially build a new device based on what was in the spacecraft to get through the crisis. And so what they did was they went into a room, they put all the pieces of everything was up in the spaceship on a table, and they completely reconfigured it to think about how to get them down. And the author, Stephen Johnson, who wrote the wonderful book Where Good Ideas Come From, uses this episode to suggest the trick to having good ideas is not to sit around in glorious isolation and try to think big thoughts. The trick is to get more parts on the table. So as we think about innovation, how do we get more parts on the table? A third is enabling the adjacent possible. Now, innovation involves, as I just said, combining things that have getting everything on the table, but it also involves getting things that weren't necessarily in the room before. We actually see this in primordial evolution, where evolution advances not by great leaps, but rather by combinations of adjacent molecules. And we see it today in technologies of the future that really are about the fusion of disparate disciplines, such as life sciences using advanced engineering, or medicine being delivered through the tools of nanotechnology, photonics, electronic engineering, and single molecule biophysics. We saw it in the last speech, where the ability to take pictures on the camera and then adding the facial recognition and then adding the database is all about this adjacent possible. Things, again, it's the combination of things that weren't really in the room before, but it's not the great leap forward, it's rather about that combination. And Johnson suggests that the history of life and human culture can be told as a story of a gradual but relentless probing of the adjacent possible, each new innovation opening up new paths to explore. And then the fourth lesson we learned that was relevant to broadband was recognize when today's logic no longer applies. New technologies often suffer from what Stanford Professor Paul David called a diffusion lag. It takes time for new technical systems to replace an existing system. For example, factories didn't reach 50% electrification until 40 years after the first central power station opened. The problem was not getting electricity, it was re-engineering factories designed and optimized for the steam era to embrace the potential benefits of electric power. Part of the cause was economic. If one just invested in a steam-driven factory, one was not anxious to lose the benefit and have to reinvest. But just as one can be anchored by sunk costs, one can also be anchored by sunk thinking. It took a long time for factory architects, well-versed in how to build vertical, steam-driven factories, to recognize that electricity could not only improve that factory, but could create the kind of horizontal factory never before conceived of. And this proved critical, by the way, for American leadership in the automobile age. So while it's understandable, such sunk thinking is also costly. The great business consultant Peter Drucker noted, the danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to react with yesterday's logic. And so history is replete with examples from the French Maginot Line to Wayne computers of yesterday's logic, jeopardizing their overly self-confident creators. But history is also replete with examples of those who use today's logic to innovate and create new opportunities to address previously intractable problems. So while there's many lessons one can learn, as we think about stimulating innovation and economic growth, the challenge can be seen as figuring out how to escape embedded thinking, empower the adjacent possible, get more parts on the table, and let chaos control. Now what's interesting is that the link to meeting all of those challenges involves creating an environment in which there is a better exchange of information. And that was at the heart of the National Broadband Plan. As we built the plan, we saw that the core task for our economy and civic society is not just the building of a network, but improving how we use its potential. And that the primary use is knowledge exchange. We gather information, analyze it, act on it, and then through a feedback loop, continually revise courses of action. We also took note of new growth economists who noted that the biggest leaps in growth are produced by meta ideas that increase the generation and the spread of ideas. And that's what we've seen in many sectors in the last couple decades, driven by three revolutions that have transformed knowledge exchange: the data revolution, the computing revolution, and the communications revolution. So knowledge exchange takes place in many forms, but inevitably shares a common platform: the broadband ecosystem, the interaction of networks, devices, applications, and above all, people who know how to use it. So we've talked for years about how broadband causes a convergence of voice, video, and data markets, how once sole source telephones, televisions, and computers are morphing into devices capable of carrying any kind of traffic. Far more important, however, is how convergence has created a commons of collaboration. As broadband is that common collaborative platform for both the economy and society, we need to have a broadband ecosystem that facilitates knowledge exchange in ways that are constantly more robust, more effective, and faster. And that's the core idea, assuring that America has a broadband ecosystem that enables high-performance knowledge exchange. Having such an ecosystem does not assure success, and not having it, however, guarantees failure. And during the planning process, the element of this kind of ecosystem became clear. The most important was that the ecosystem must constantly evolve and improve. Improvements in each element should drive improvements in others in a constant virtuous feedback loop. better applications driving more usage, driving upgraded networks, driving more powerful devices. Consistent with the kind of things that Craig was talking about. You get the networks, you get out and you develop new uses, more people get on it, and that drives more and more progress for the society. Now I have to say that this vision is actually in stark contrast with the historic vision for telecommunications policy in the United States, as that policy, both in word and expenditure, usually focuses not on use for all, but rather on subsidizing wireline telephone networks for the most rural of citizens. Some of you benefit from the world as it is, and I think it's very important that we continue to make sure that there are networks everywhere. But we also have to recognize that the legacy of that historic vision often serves as an anchor and not an engine of economic growth. Because while focusing on that, how do we get wireline networks to the most rural of residents, we ignore the thing that's more important in terms of economic growth, which is an ecosystem that keeps pushing an envelope in a way that improves the odds of having technological leadership. Now, in the old world of unquestioned American supremacy, the AT&T monopoly and Bell Labs rose to the challenge. But in today's world, it's much more difficult. One reads of massive wireline upgrades in Korea, Japan, as well as other places in Asia and Europe. Just the other week came another report of a company in England seeking to invest $800 million to connect 50,000 businesses and 4% of British homes to open access fiber. One does not read of such reports in the United States in wireline infrastructure, and I certainly don't blame the companies, the wireline companies, because having been a Wall Street analyst for 8 years, I understand the pressures that they're under and the difficulties they would face if they tried to do such an upgrade. But that leaves open a big-time question for the U.S., one that has huge consequences. How do we make sure the United States does not fall behind in creating a new generation of networks and services based not just on world-class networks, but world-leading networks? How do we make sure we have the people that know how to design, build, operate, and most of all, innovate on top of the next generation of networks? Now, the National Broadband Plan suggested a critical mass of test beds, but frankly, we did not come up with a practical way to stimulate them. Fortunately, Google took on the challenge and is building one itself very close to here. But just as importantly, it caused 1,100 communities to self-organize to do the kind of things Craig was talking about earlier to improve the business case for new or upgraded networks. And those communities acted with very different motives, but a common link. All recognized world-leading networks would give their communities a competitive edge. But that caused some of us to then ask which communities could most quickly provide that critical mass of test beds? Which had the two elements most critical to success, the best economics and the most innovative culture? And the answer quickly became clear: university towns. As the great Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, if one wanted to create a successful city, one should build 2 world-class research universities and then wait for 50 years. That insight that great research institutions are engines of growth is absolutely right, as anyone looking at the history of the internet would immediately recognize. And we in the United States still have the greatest collection of research institutions anywhere in the world. But we don't think we have to wait 50 years, nor can we afford to, if we can throw a world-leading bandwidth into the mix. Because just as manufacturing grew in the 19th and 20th century by combining new sources of power with new modes of transportation, we believe the fastest growing parts of our economy, the sectors in which better understanding of data is the principal source of wealth creation, require us to combine the best of human capital with the best of bandwidth. As I noted above, broadband is the commons of collaboration for our time. Combining communities that surround our research institutions with world-leading bandwidth will demonstrate that high-performance collaboration and not one-way video, not restaurant reviews, not discount shopping, is the killer app for the next generation of the internet. And so, over the spring and the summer, 37 university communities, including Columbia, Missouri, have come together for a common mission: accelerating the deployment of next-generation networks and services in the United States. We think if we remove bandwidth as a barrier to innovation for the right 1% of the country, we can increase the value of providing massive bandwidth and also increase economic growth for the other 99% of the country. And if we remove bandwidth as a barrier, in these 37 geographically diverse communities, we can create a distributed model of innovation hubs that can make sure our economy grows everywhere and not just in small regions of our country. So how do state and local governments fit into this effort to create bandwidth-based innovation hubs? A few thoughts on this. First, it has to do with big data. As noted above, big data computing is creating revolutionary breakthroughs in commerce, science, and society. Advances in digital sensors, communications, computations, and storage have created huge new collections of data. A recent and very important study by McKinsey suggested that whole new industries and restructurings of existing industries will be built on the ability to share and analyze that data. One of the sectors most discussed is government. In the report, it talks about how they looked at European governments and suggested there's between 150 to 300 billion euros in Europe that can be a value creation to be done through how government utilizes big data, through transparency, enabling experimentation, exposing variability, segmenting populations, and other levers. It's beyond the scope of the discussion this morning to go into the details, but what's relevant is that being able to take advantage of big data effectively requires, not everywhere, but in certain critical places, ultra-high-speed networking. As various levels of government contemplate how best to take advantage of big data, there ought to be a concurrent effort to aggregate demand to drive the deployment of world-leading networks so that there's a critical mass somewhere in every state where people can have access to the kinds of networks to take advantage of the big data revolution. Of course, this has been done in the past here in Missouri and elsewhere with anchor institutions and regional networks. And thank goodness it was done. If it hadn't been done, it would have been the #1 recommendation of the National Broadband Plan. But now is the time to build on that legacy. Now is the time to enable the adjacent possible, as the opportunity now is even greater for those kinds of networks. A second thing, focus on existing assets. Now there's a wonderful story, again from Stephen Johnson's book on innovation, about how an obstetrician in Paris in the 1870s witnessed the death of 2/3 of babies born with low weight. One day he was visiting the zoo and noticed how they used incubators to hatch eggs, and he said, I wonder if that would help with kids. He built a similar machine for human babies. He halved the mortality rate. He was using existing assets. 130 years later, an MIT researcher in Indonesia noticed that there were lots of low-weight babies dying in the hospital while these $40,000 machines were laying in the corner because they were broken and couldn't be fixed. So he also observed that cars were always being fixed. And so he made the interesting adjacent possible leap and said, I wonder if we can build machines to help babies live out of car parts. And sure enough, he was able to do that. And now you have machines that can be fixed. So both stories go to Johnson's earlier messages about the adjacent possible innovations, but they have a special message for governments, particularly in a time of austerity. Innovation can start with the better utilization of existing assets. And you saw that in the discussion of how we can use really existing technology to improve public safety performance. Another example of that is the deal that Kansas City, both in Missouri and in Kansas, struck with Google. The interesting and somewhat overlooked framework is that the relationship is not, as it is in so many other economic development situations, the city effectively paying out-of-pocket cash to get a new entrant to come in and build something. Instead, the city is taking a number of steps, both cities, that have the effect of reducing Google's CapEx, OpEx, and risk and improving their revenues. The out-of-pocket direct benefits to Google are significant, but the out-of-pocket costs for the cities are marginal, if any. So what you have is an asymmetry of benefits, which is really terrific. That's where the magic is, because it allows the city to leverage assets that otherwise would not be creating the kind of value that now in the context of the Google deal they're creating. Another example was earlier this week, Seattle announced that they are going to kind of throw 500 miles of dark fiber into the mix for someone who wants to come and do a gig.u project. Again, an asset that was being underutilized can be better utilized, and that's where we really need to, that's how we need to look at it. A third thing is to make sure investments and buying power support high performance platforms. Governments are major buyers of all kinds of goods and services. The principal goal is, as it should be, to make sure taxpayers are getting good value. But governments also drive improvements through how and what it buys. In particular, it can drive experimentation by leading with small purchases that drive new investments. This was true in the era of canals, the time of the telegraph, and it's also true in the time of the era of the internet. Indeed, one could argue that the $75 million the federal government invested in National Science Foundation Net, and later 150 into ARPA, has created about $240 billion a year in various goods and services, meaning that that initial 225 million dwarfs Peter's, I think it was Peter Minuet, who was it that bought Manhattan for $24? Anyway, the government's purchase of these, the original foundation stones of the internet was the greatest bargain of all time. Again, the principle of laying the platform for high-performance knowledge exchange and demand aggregation apply. Every purchase of communication services should be seen through the lens of how it could be leveraged to create an innovation hub in your area. Not every purchase will qualify, but many will. Another is bringing new bandwidth to clusters where it can do the most good. The famous Harvard business professor Michael Porter has advocated a cluster strategy for economic development. Such a strategy is based on the view that geographic, cultural, and institutional proximity provides companies with special access, closer relationships, better information, and other advantages that are hard to tap at a distance. There's a little bit of irony here, since broadband in some ways destroys distances, but nonetheless you still see constantly development of clusters of expertise. There are different kinds of clusters. Some more than others depend on the ability to capture and send data, to collaborate to and from non-local sources. For those kinds of clusters, next generation bandwidth will become over time table stakes. But the sooner such networks arrive, the stronger the cluster will become. So a good target in every state is the community in which major research universities and often the major research hospitals reside. It may not be the only target, but it's a good place to start, in part because every such institution already has expertise in which the region has a competitive advantage. So you put things in Columbia that give those doctors the ability to talk to read MRIs being sent to them by doctors throughout the state of Missouri, for which there's already, in some sense, a social network. And you create much greater value by bringing these big networks here. And then finally, I would say it's important to have a plan, but it's also very important to have a spirit of bold, persistent experimentation. A phrase that comes from FDR, 1932. He was right then, and it's true today. Now, I have to say I sympathize with public officials who want to experiment but feel hemmed in by the instant criticism at the heart of the 24-hour news cycle. But having said that, we really have no choice. Progress depends upon experimentation, and experiments by their nature are going to fail, and sometimes and often. Every private sector company knows this, and I think the public knows it too and is willing to take calculated risk, even in this time of austerity. The key is to articulate a mission of significant importance so that the public will accept some level of failure. In this regard, we need that experimentation in the context of a plan. Plan beats no plan. And if the vision is right, the plan can adjust as the experimentation proceeds. The state of Hawaii this summer launched a plan to be the first state to get a gigabit to all their anchor institutions. And it's not going to be easy, but particularly given their geographic position, it's a compelling vision that I think that is very popular in the state. But there are other visions that will lead in the right direction. For example, some states have already announced plans to replace textbooks with tablets, not only increasing the demand for broadband, but massively improving the delivery of educational content. Another one would be announcing that as a state you're going to end paper transactions. This will also be hard, but requires help to the population that's offline. But such an announcement and the plan will end up saving money and improving performance and helping all become a greater part of the society and the economy. Now, I know that Missouri has done a terrific job with its plan, and you could see from the earlier sessions that there's already a lot of work for which the state should be much praised. I would just note that while it's very important to do the kind of work that was done in terms of asking people what they want, we should also note as to this, Henry Ford's famous line that if he had asked his customers what he wanted, they would have said faster horses. As Steve Jobs has demonstrated, sometimes you need to make progress, not by asking what the customer wants, but by having a different vision. And I was struck by the governor's statement that it's a quantum leap. What a quantum actually means in physics is where you have the kind of leap such that the rules don't really apply. It's an absolute change. Electric power was an absolute change. Computing power was an absolute change. And so, it's often in the history of media, you see vaudeville becomes radio, and the first radio shows are basically vaudeville in front of a mic. The first television shows are radio shows in front of a camera. But eventually a completely different form emerges as people start to understand today's logic. And so don't get hemmed in by what people say, because while it's important to know that, it's also important to move beyond that. So there are many paths, but the bottom line is if we can articulate how we can take our world-leading research institutions to create new industries and economic growth, if we can create an understanding of how education, healthcare, public safety, job training, and other essential services can be improved by moving more of them to the digital platform, we can, as FDR did, create a climate of understanding that rewards initiative and innovation in the public realm, as it does in the private realm. Now, there are no guarantees. Innovation doesn't work that way. But as innovation authority Steve Johnson noted, chance favors the connected mind. So we should do what we can to make sure we connect in the best possible way the best minds in our area. Let me conclude with a thought from Duke Provost, who said, research is an expression of faith in the possibility of progress. The drive that leads scholars to study a topic has to include the belief that new things can be discovered, that the newer can be better, and that the greater depth of understanding is achievable. Research, particularly academic research, is a form of optimism about the human condition. Gig.U is about supercharging that form of optimism with unlimited bandwidth and having it meet its adjacent possible in the communities adjacent to our great centers of research. If we do that, we won't have to look around the world and say, in the title of the book I referenced earlier, that used to be us. Rather, if we succeed in creating a platform for high-performance knowledge exchange, we will be able to say, this is still us. Thank you very much.